She stood on the edge of the old Khorasan frontier in the early spring of the 13th century, watching soldiers lead her daughter into a column of prisoners that stretched beyond the dust line of the road. The girl, barely into her mid-teens, did not cry out because she knew resistance would only sharpen her fate. Her name was Zaria, and it already lived inside the ledgers of a rising empire that cataloged human lives with relentless care. Age, stature, the slope of a jaw, the cut of the eyes, each detail recorded with a clerk's calm hand. What happened to girls like her did not begin or end with one raid. It belonged to a larger design, where bodies became lines on a chart and motherhood turned into an instrument of rule. The chronicles would not describe it that way. They would speak of cities taken and tribute counted, of banners raised and kings made to kneel. But what the ledgers hid, memory preserved. It lived in lullabies that fell quiet, in lineages that shifted course, in a silence that lasted centuries. This was not only conquest by arms, it was an attempt to reshape people from within, to fold strangers into a single will by controlling the most intimate future anyone possesses, the children yet to be born. To see how that design took shape, one must return to the Mongolian steppe, to a year remembered as the birth of a boy who would be called by many names. He arrived in a world where survival meant taking what another held, and where the weak were taught their limits by hunger and night wind. His tribe was small and harried, circled by rivals who cut off their herds and their hopes. As a child, he learned the lesson that divides the living. There are those who seize and those who are seized. He watched his father die under the shadow of poisoned hospitality. He watched his mother, Hoelun, gather her children and endure winter on roots and raw fish, weighing each mouthful as if it were a coin. In his mid-teens, the girl promised to him, Berta, was carried off by enemies. Weeks turned to months. Rumors grew like weeds. She had been violated. She had been given to another. She had been killed. When she was finally recovered, she bore a child, and no one could say whose blood ran in the veins of the newborn. That night altered him. Grief cooled into something clear. Women were not merely spoils to be counted after the clash, they were the future itself. Whoever held that future did not need to hold every wall or mount every gate. People could be changed from the inside out. Years later, when the scattered Mongol tribes raised him as a universal ruler, he had already begun to think in protocols rather than impulses. What some administrators would later call a system of permanent seating did not appear as a philosophy on a parchment. It arrived as procedure, steps to be followed, lists to be kept, roles to be assigned, and it moved in the wake of armies like a second, quieter force. The first great demonstrations came against neighbors to the west and south, and the pattern hardened in place. The columns that followed were not only wagons of grain and bolts of felt, but wagons built for a different task, to sort, confine, and move human beings according to their capacity to bear life. Spies went ahead of the standards, not only to measure walls and gates, but to count women by age and kin, to note who had borne children and who had not, to mark families whose features were prized. Scribes drew up secret rolls with the precision of merchants balancing a ledger. When a city fell, the torrent of chaos did not wash everything away. It was channeled. Men of fighting age were cut down or herded into chains. Women were divided into groups that a clerk could understand at a glance. The youngest and strongest marked first. Those who had already given birth marked next. The elderly, the sick, the too young, sent off and forgotten. Ink on a wrist replaced a name. A number replaced a life. Behind the vanguard, the caravans created a moving geography of control. There were wagons partitioned for different stages of gestation, tents assigned to those newly taken, to those confirmed with child, to those who had just delivered, and to those deemed unproductive. There were field medics who learned to time cycles, to push or delay as needed, to dose herbs that coaxed the body one way or another. There were midwives whose hands were steadier than their hearts. It was not the violence alone that hollowed the soul, but the orderliness of it. The forms, the tallies, the procedures repeated until they felt like law. Every assault became an entry, every pregnancy, a line, every birth, a verdict about the child's future. Those judged fit to fold into the conqueror's house were taken to be raised among the victors. Those judged unfit vanished between one page and the next. The code etched into the skin told a complete story: origin, capacity, previous births, projected worth. The women who tried to keep a fragment of themselves carved tiny scars where ink could not speak. Others whispered real names into small ears during a last night together, a final attempt to tie a thread across a splitting world. In a single generation, even that thin thread could snap. As campaigns pivoted east and south, the machinery grew more confident. Columns stretched for days, not miles. There were divisions for capture, for classification, for what officials called acclimatization, a bitter word for the long pressure that breaks a will. There were divisions for early pregnancy and late pregnancy, for delivery, for recovery, for reassignment. Each had its own overseers and routines. In some places, keeping a mother near an infant in the first weeks made her more compliant. In others, separation after a set time made defiance crumble for good. Nobles received a different theater, finer tents, high-ranking visitors, for reasons that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with breeding ambitions within the ruling class. Peasant women were processed in swells, valued for endurance, for surviving what would kill the pampered. Resistance found forms that paper could not hold. A glance became a signal. A pattern of hands became a warning. Women taught one another how to feign health or feign illness, how to starve without leaving a mark, how to turn the body into a riddle that officials could not solve. The most painful resistance was the quiet kind. The songs in the dark that remembered names the ledgers had erased, the small rituals that kept a fragment of home alive long after the tents had moved on. The deeper genius of the system, if one can call it that, lay in permanence. Steel can be beaten, walls can be rebuilt, but children carry yesterday forward whether anyone wishes it or not. One child becomes two, and two become many, and in that multiplication lies a victory that survives lost battles and broken crowns. Centuries later, scholars peering into the patterns of inheritance would find trails that point back to a handful of men and their favored houses, evidence not of love or chance, but of policy made flesh. The reach of the design was not limited to a single ruler. Sons and grandsons, generals and governors, all learned to carry its logic with them as they crossed deserts and rivers. Even death did not end the pattern. When the great commander finally fell on campaign, the caravans did not stop. They were divided as spoils among princes. The children born under the system were raised to serve it, and the manuals, written from years of practice, became the cold heart of future wars. Funeral rites that horrified witnesses were only the surface. The deeper offering was made in secret, in the places where no mourners were allowed, where the empire severed loose ends to ensure continuity. Mass graves covered what the ledgers could not openly praise, arranged with the same order that had governed the living. Archaeologists have uncovered the echo of that order in places where the empire once moved like a storm. They have found the bones of young women clustered apart from the warriors, signs of hunger etched into the ribs, fractures that healed poorly after long marches, and the small skeletons of infants laid without the rites given soldiers. In one site, near a storied city of the Silk Roads, two bodies lay side by side, an older woman and a girl. Analysis revealed a mother and her daughter. The soil around the younger bones spoke of journeys measured not in miles, but in partings. The mother was local, the daughter had traveled far. The system that moved behind the banners was not born from a single order shouted on a windy ridge. It evolved step by step, shaped by victories and adjusted after mistakes. Scouts learned which districts held women of childbearing age, which families had lines prized by local elites, which midwives might be coerced into service. Scribes refined their ledgers until each column answered a particular question: age bands, prior births, physical markers, kin ties, temperaments under stress. What looked like improvisation during the first campaigns hardened into routine. A city fell, and within hours the same rooms were seized: a storehouse for provisions, a courtyard for sorting, a hall for first examinations, a side street for those deemed expendable. Doctors working under military seal cultivated a specialty that had no gentle name. They tracked cycles as if they were supply routes. They used herbs to hasten what the body might delay, and diets to steady what might falter. They experimented with methods that multiplied the chance of twins. They adjusted rations to keep women strong enough to carry life, but not so strong that they could fight the system. They learned that fear shattered some and steeled others, and they tuned the mix of threat and reward until compliance rose on their charts. There was always a chart. Every tent had a chart. Resistance did not disappear. It changed shape. Women shared knowledge in glances and gestures, developed codes that passed between them without sound. They taught each other how to conceal early signs, how to fake symptoms that bought a few days of rest, how to move pain from where it was to where a guard expected it to be. Some starved themselves slowly in ways that left no obvious bruise. Others damaged their bodies in small, hidden cuts to spark fevers that delayed assignment. A few took risks that ended in public punishment, and their suffering became a warning staged for the rest. Terror was a policy, but so was survival. The caravans themselves became cities that never stopped moving. There were divisions for capture and intake, divisions for cataloging and marking, divisions for what clerks called acclimatization, a long erosion of the will under rules that offered no appeal. Then came early pregnancy and late pregnancy, delivery and postpartum, reassignment or removal. Each division had overseers, healers, guards, and interpreters who knew enough of local tongues to give orders and record replies. Wagons were partitioned by stage, and tents were grouped into clusters around a central point where the ledgers were kept and guarded as if they were treasure. The logic spread beyond the steppe. In river cities to the east, the machine learned to use water for speed. Barges replaced carts. In mountain towns to the west, the planners adjusted to snow and thin air, shortening the time between capture and transport to prevent escape into high passes. Everywhere the same pattern appeared: the swift, loud seizure of a city by force, followed by the slower, quieter seizure of its future. Officials noticed that the presence of infants calmed mothers for a season, and they used that season to set new routines, only to divide them afterward when obedience had become habit. The line between calculation and cruelty vanished because the results looked the same on paper. For nobles, the theater was different. Tents were larger, bedding softer, guards more polished in speech. High officers visited, not for kindness, but to fold certain features into the lineages that would later rule. The aim was not only to expand numbers, but to weave selected traits into families that carried banners and titles. For commoners, the process was faster and colder, timed to the march drum. Endurance was praised on ledgers the way courage was praised in songs. The same pen that marked the stealing of grain could also mark the stealing of a womb. By the time the empire turned with full strength toward the rich lands of the East, the engine was running at a scale that mapmakers struggled to imagine. Columns of women moved behind columns of cavalry, separated by days of dust. Camps rose and fell on a rhythm so steady that the ground itself seemed to remember where to accept the next tent peg. In some districts, numbers swelled toward counts that people repeated with disbelief. Tens of thousands taken in one season, hundreds of thousands processed across routes that ran from the heartland of the steppe to the edges of distant forests. Not every number can be trusted, but the shape of the truth is plain. The system was vast, and it was meant to be. The horror did not depend on rage. Rage burns out. What kept this machine alive was procedure and the promise of results measured not in days, but in generations. The rulers understood that an occupied city can revolt, but a lineage altered from within will not return to what it was. A son raised under the conqueror's roof learns the conqueror's songs. A daughter bearing children into the conqueror's house turns yesterday into tomorrow without a soldier on the wall. Time does the work that swords begin. Centuries later, when scholars count fathers by following markers that pass from man to son, they find patterns that ripple outward from a few central figures. The numbers they propose vary in detail, but they point in the same direction. An astonishing share of living men trace their lines to a narrow circle of rulers and their closest kin. In some homelands, the share climbs to a figure that startles even those who expect to be startled. In neighboring regions, the portion drops but does not disappear. The legacy is not a single tree, but a grove planted with intention. This legacy did not end with one man's last breath. The manuals that grew from field practice became the bones of policy. Sons and grandsons, commanders and governors carried them like scripture from one campaign to the next. Each new theater brought refinements. Against strong walls, scouts favored bribery that opened gates from within so the sorting could begin before smoke cleared. Against nomads, speed mattered most, and the system learned to create temporary holding rings with horses and rope. In wet country, boats replaced wagons. In dry country, the march staggered around wells that could support a moving city of the eye captured. Always the same goal, to turn the making of life into an arm of power. Even ceremonies around death were drafted into service. When a great ruler died far from home, the rites that followed were elaborate by design, meant to bind allies and frighten rivals. Offerings were made, some of them human. What chroniclers whispered about is not the only truth. Beneath the public displays ran quieter acts meant to erase loose ends, to prevent flight during the pause between one reign and the next. Pits swallowed what the ledgers dared not celebrate. Those pits remain, and shovels have found them. In the ground once walked by armies, archaeologists uncover proof written not in ink but in bone. They find clusters of young women interred apart from ranks of warriors, their remains marked by hunger that lasted seasons, by breaks that mended poorly after forced travel. Nearby lie infants and toddlers set down without the rites given to soldiers or elders. In one place near a city of scholars and traders, two bodies were placed side by side, one older, one younger. Tests reveal a mother and a daughter. The older belonged to the soil of that place. The younger had traveled far before the earth accepted her. A story that began with a mother watching a daughter taken ends with a mother and daughter buried together. Not every number can be counted, and not every cry leaves a record, yet the outlines remain. Administrators spoke the language of ratios and targets. They praised efficiency where others would have seen only grief. They compared one season's outcomes to the last and wrote recommendations as if they were improving a mill or a bridge. The coldness was part of the force. It taught those inside the machine that nothing personal remained. The rules would run, with or without a name attached. Within those rules, small mercies appeared by accident and were gone by nightfall. A guard who looked away at the right moment. A midwife who smuggled a lullaby into a tent where songs were forbidden. A scribe who left a gap in a ledger where a number should have gone. These slips did not overthrow the system, but they gave it edges that were not perfectly sharp. Along those edges, some women escaped, some children were hidden, some threads were saved for later. Survival, when it came, was not clean. It carried fear forward, and the fear taught caution to the next generation. The rulers knew that fear could be harvested too. They staged punishments where many could see them. They chose times when the sun stood high and shadows were short. They used ropes and poles and pits, the simplest tools, and they invited rumor to carry the scene for weeks. But they also learned that a life preserved can be more useful than a life ended, and so mercy was rationed like grain. A woman might be kept near her child long enough to soften, then separated when habit took hold. A family might be spared in part so that the message of obedience would travel home in flesh and memory. Calculation wore the mask of chance. The empire's march reshaped trade roads as well as bloodlines. Markets adapted to follow the great movement of people and goods. Camps grew near river bends where boats could be repaired, near crossroads where animals could be stabled, near groves where wood was straight enough for wheel spokes. Traders sold salt and cloth and pots designed for travel and quick cleaning, and they learned the rhythms of the caravans so well that they arrived a day before and left a day after. Even in horror, commerce found its timing. In the courts where decisions were stamped, men spoke of order and destiny. They said the sky had granted mandate, and that mandate required the bending of many to the will of a few. They wrote laws that were short and clear for the soldier and long and precise for the scribe. They praised discipline and punished hesitation. They taught their sons that a house is strong when its branches reach across valleys, and that the quickest way to plant a forest is to push seed into soil that others have tended for years. They called it wisdom. The conquered called it by other names that did not survive in ink. Across winters and summers, the machine adapted to weather. In deep cold, the tents were pitched closer, not for warmth alone, but so guards could see with fewer torches. In high heat, marches began before dawn and ended before the flat eye of noon. Water was rationed for the living, and a different water was set aside for the dead to keep sickness from running through the ranks. Disease was an enemy the generals learned to fear. They posted watchers not only on ridges, but at wells and cook fires, and they measured the health of the caravans with the same focus they gave to horses and grain. A faltering column could slow an army more than a skirmish. When the campaigns reached cities whose walls were stories high and whose gates could swallow oxen 2 by 2, the machine did not halt. It learned to enter through purchase and promise, a gatekeeper with a debt, a merchant with a grudge, a priest who saw which way the wind would blow. Gold and titles opened what rams might break, and once the banners crossed a threshold, the old routine took over. Sorting, marking, moving. The quiet conquest that followed the loud one never changed its steps for long. Time, which grinds mountains to powder, also softened the edges of memory. In some places, grandchildren heard only that their grandfather had ridden with a great army, or that their grandmother had come from far away and spoke a lullaby no one else knew. Songs lost verses. Names lost vowels. Stories shrank to a phrase. Yet the body remembered the curve of a cheek, the shape of eyes, the way a hand settled on a child's back. Lineages that would never meet in peace became neighbors under one roof. Scholars centuries later took their tools to bone and to blood. They read sequences the way monks once read illuminated pages. They found clusters that were too large to be ordinary chance. They traced signatures that spread like the branches of a great river from a narrow spring. They argued about the steepness of the bank and the depth of the channel, but not about the direction of the flow. The past, they said, had been written into the living with a pen that did not run dry. What returned from that research to the people who had always lived with inherited silence was not comfort, but clarity. It explained what songs could not. It gave cause where before there had only been effect. It gave some a name to put on a feeling that had passed through mothers to daughters and fathers to sons without words. Others rejected the mirror. They said the present should not be chained to a strategy forged by men long dead. Both responses were true in their way. The living must make a world out of what they are given, and not all gifts are chosen. In the lands once crossed by dust and banners, monuments rose to victories and to grief. Stones named the fallen. Poems praised riders whose bones were wind now. Temples prayed for souls who had suffered under orders written in a hand as steady as any sermon. The earth kept its own record, layers of ash, streaks of iron, shards of pottery, a bead that broke free from a burial cloth, the slant of a trench that once held a line of nameless dead. A map of sorrow and achievement lay under the grass. The mother and daughter found near the old trade city became a story that teachers told to students who were new to the idea that history is not only dates and crowns. It is also the distance between two graves and the direction the younger bones traveled before they lay down. It is the space between a whisper and a ledger line. It is the oil on a midwife's hands and the dirt under a scribe's fingernails. It is the moment when a commander decides that tomorrow matters more than today, and the moment, somewhere else, when a woman decides that the last thing she can keep is a name. The machine served power, but power could not serve the machine forever. Empires thin as they spread. Roads fray. Costs rise. New enemies learn the old tricks and set their own. What seemed like fate becomes friction. What seemed unsurpassable becomes ordinary. In time, the same procedures that once made victory easy became weights that slowed advance. The caravans ate grain that cavalry needed. The guards who watched the tents could not ride the flank. The engine that had made the empire swift began to make it slow. Yet the logic endured beyond banners and borders. It lingered where people believe that control of tomorrow justifies the breaking of today. It resurfaced in new forms with new words. It wore uniforms of different colors. It learned new technologies and kept the old aim. That is the bitter lesson that outlasts any one realm. The tools that turn life into policy do not die with a dynasty. They drift. They wait for a willing hand. And so the story circles back to the woman on the road and the girl who did not cry out. Their names may fade, their faces blur, but the pattern they were caught in is legible to anyone who looks closely at how power sustains itself. It captures bodies. It manages births. It writes ledgers that pretend to be neutral. It prefers quiet victories that last longer than drums. Against that, there are only the ordinary strengths that have always stood up. Stubborn memory, shared warning, the courage to carry a thread through darkness and tie it to a morning someone else will see.